What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're getting started on the truck camper build. If you haven't watched the first video, I recommend you go back and watch that first. I go over the whole build and my design and my kind of thoughts and ideas on how I want this thing to play out. And I'll have that linked in the description for you guys. Just to give you guys a look at the amount of material we're working with here. These are the beams you guys saw in the first video. And then I picked up these from Metal Supermarkets in Richmond, Virginia. So these are the remainder of the pieces. And then there's three 60 by 120 sheets. And we'll have a cost breakdown video at the end of this series just to give you guys a full build cost so you can get an idea of whether you want to tackle something like this yourself or not. First thing we're going to tackle here is actually the main structure that hangs over the front of the truck. This side is going to be 9 feet long and this is going to be about 60 inches wide. We're using a 3-inch by 4-inch beam and it is 1/8 of an inch thick wall. And for our corners, we are doing a 45-degree cut so they can mate up nicely and I don't have to cap any tubes, and it'll have a nice finished look on the outside edges. If you guys have been following the channel for any amount of time, you will know that this is the same Harbor Freight bandsaw that I built my last 3 trailers with, and we're gonna be using it to make some of the cuts on this build as well. Specifically our top beams, because I want these 45-degree cuts to be extremely accurate. I have set this up, done a few test runs on a little bit smaller material to make sure that it's gonna be cutting straight, and I got it cutting real good. The only issue I did run into is that at a 45-degree angle, a 3-inch wide piece didn't quite fit. So I did have to notch our holder here to allow us to be able to have this bolt in here and crank it up and hold it still while we're cutting. So yeah, let's get into it. These being the most expensive parts of the build as far as material goes, I really took my time and used my digital level to make sure I was getting a nice clean cut. All right, we hit our next challenge on cutting this aluminum. As you can see, the bandsaw is actually starting to hit this corner, so that's as far as it's gonna cut. I did have to remove that shield. I was showing you where it was hitting. Once I removed that shield, it was able to make the cut all the way through and everything looks nice and clean. So we'll go ahead and cut this at a total of 9 feet with a 45 at the other side. 45 on this side is gonna be going this way. You'll notice I take the level and put it on the bandsaw. There's a 0 button you hit which zeroes it out on whatever surface it's sitting on, and then from there I can put it on top of my material and make sure that it is also at 0. This ensures that we're getting a nice straight cut that's not crooked. One of the best ways I've found to make sure anything you're building that's supposed to be a square or a rectangle with 45-degree cuts is when you have 2 opposing sides, when you go to make a cut with your second one, no matter what you think you measured your first one to, use your original one to measure your second one. What we got here is our end is sitting nice and flush, so we know that matches up. And then what I've done is matched it up here, made it so whenever I drop the bandsaw, it is sitting perfectly flush up against this edge. Then I removed this piece with a scribe mark right here and made sure that the blade is still falling in the correct place. And this will ensure that when I remove this piece and start cutting my next section here, it's gonna be the exact same length as our other opposing side. And I'm gonna be doing that with our front as well as our back. Here we got a quick visual representation of the methods I was just explaining previously. Got all of our pieces cut, went ahead and swept the floor so we got a nice even surface to lay this thing out on. I'm not gonna weld those just yet. What I'm gonna do is actually take advantage of the scrap pieces we have here. The bandsaw did a great job of making a nice clean cut as long as I went nice and slow. I did break one blade, I had to go and pick one up. No big deal. For anybody with the same bandsaw, Tractor Supply actually stocks these, and that's the size you need to replace the blade on the Harbor Freight bandsaw. But now that I have these on the bench, I'm gonna do some practice welds. The main welds that I'm concerned about dialing in the settings for are these outer ones. I do plan to grind all these welds just for aesthetics purposes, so technically it doesn't quite matter how they look. I just want them to be full penetration and be nice and strong. So I'll do a few test welds. I have these pieces here, and then of course I have these 2 large pieces, which I could even cut down into smaller pieces. So I have multiple different opportunities to practice all the welds that I'll be doing on this when the time comes. If you're new to aluminum welding, I highly recommend taking those scrap pieces and doing some practice runs before you dive in. It truly does make a big difference and it can make the outcome of your project way better. We got the beams all tacked up. We used our Fireball tool square that you guys may be familiar with from previous builds. Definitely helps out a lot having a nice sturdy metal square to be able to center things up. I went ahead and measured this and it came out to be 125.5 inches and then 125 half, and then like just almost a 16th. So that tells me that it's less than a 16th within square, which is awesome. You know, can't really ask much more for that, especially doing it on a garage floor like this with just some basic tools. Next up, we're gonna work on getting it all finish welded. I want this all to be, you know, completely welded and final, so it's not gonna be able to make tweak or move around on me. And what we're gonna do is actually weld each of these outside edge corners first. And we're gonna do that because as a weld cools, it actually pulls. So when you're welding all these corners, it's gonna try to pull the beams this way, but the fact that they're tacked in all four corners, it's not going to be able to pull it anywhere. So we'll go here, 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 and then here. And then after that, we will do our side joints. We'll go ahead and do this joint, and then I will do the underside joint over there. So basically diagonal from it, but opposite side, and then likewise here. And then our last welds are gonna be at our 90-degree corners, and that'll really lock everything in, and we should have a nice square frame to build the rest of our camper off of. In welding, there's such thing as welding up or downhill, which you are fighting gravity with your weld pool as you go. Standing it up on its side like this makes it a lot easier to just weld horizontally, just like I practice on the workbench. So every opportunity I got to stand this thing up on its side and weld horizontally versus up or downhill, I took. With all of our welds fully done, next we're going to work on knocking these welds down to smooth out this finish and make it look nice. As you can see, the welds turned out pretty good. Like I mentioned, I'm still new at aluminum welding, so don't expect them to be perfect, and I'm sure it'll progress over time. Of course, our inside edge, we're not going to worry about knocking that down. It's just going to be these corners. After my welds are done, I put a couple extra tacks on the end just so I can reshape this corner and make it look like these pieces came formed together. First, we're gonna hit it with some 36 grit flat disc, and then I'll probably move to 60 and then down to 80. And then I even have a mouse sander that I'll probably switch to and end up sanding over this whole thing and make it nice and prepped and ready to get on with the rest of the build. Taking your time with sanding this down in different steps can really pay off in the end when it comes to the overall finish. So I was in no rush to complete this task. You'll notice partway through I did put on a mask. I realized with the garage door shut and the dust flying everywhere, it probably wasn't good to be breathing in those aluminum particles. So just be sure to wear some PPE while you're doing this. Got everything all sanded and smoothed out. I used a mouse with some 220 after I ground down the welds to really give everything a nice even finish, just because there were some marks and stuff like that. It gives you an opportunity to get up any sort of spatter or anything on here. So the next part of the build is doing our legs and our bottom frame. What I'm gonna do is actually build a wooden frame on some wheels and casters. That way I can get this thing built and be able to spin it around or move it in and out of the garage as I need room. It should be really convenient. I'm really happy I decided to smooth all these edges. Of course, I wish that I was just already incredible at TIG welding and I could just have some nice clean beads running all the way around here. I'm sure it'd be a lot stronger. That being said, for anybody watching who welds aluminum for a living or any sort of welder, I know me grinding this down has made it not as strong as it should be. That being said, the legs that are gonna tie into here are gonna tie these pieces together. I do plan to put like a 90-degree gusset in here in all four corners just to help strengthen it up even more. I know that's a bit of a trade-off for having it look nice and clean, but I think me reinforcing it in other areas will ensure that I have no worries about these being able to crack. Besides that, as far as like the frame of the bed is going to tie these together, and also this isn't really load bearing. I mean, the main load bearing is this beam here. So when we're laying, that's going to take all the load. I do plan to do some gussets to like the actual bed structure. So I really shouldn't have to worry about it, but I am going to strengthen it up a bunch just so I don't have to have any concerns later on down the road once this thing's been rattling down some trails and all that good stuff. So what we got here is the wood dolly that we're going to be building this camper on. The way I've made it, when you're standing on the floor here, the height of these side rails is the same height as the bed rails in the Tacoma. So as I'm building this camper out, I'm going to be standing inside here. I can get a feel for my space and where I want to put things, and it should kind of help how I lay out the design of this. It only took about 7 2x4s from Lowe's, and then I already had some caster wheels laying around in the garage that I used and some deck screws. All in all, I probably got about 30 bucks in this because I already had the caster wheels and screws, so it's real cheap. I'll probably use it as camper shell storage after I'm done with this, since I have a camper shell currently on my truck. But it would be nice to be able to spin the camper around and get to welds, or maybe get certain spots under some good lighting while I'm working on it. So now that we got our wood dolly built, we're going to start working on our base here. It's going to consist of 1x2 1/8 of an inch wall, and we're going to be 63 inches of overall length and then 63 inches of overall width. So the bed of the Tacoma actually kind of curves in as it goes towards the tailgate. So although 64, 65 inches would be ideal up front, as you go to the back, we'd have some overhang. Most campers that I've looked online have an overall width of 63 inches, so it seems like that works best. So we are going to have some 45-degree cuts just like we did at our tops here. And then of course we're gonna have some straight cuts in the rear. So we'll go ahead and get those all cut out, and then we'll start working on fixing them together and jig them up and get it all welded. One of the really nice things about using a bandsaw is it's almost like having a second person there that's just doing the cutting for you. And in the meantime, you can work on some other stuff like sand some edges or just prep some things to be cut next. The garage floor is the closest thing I have to a flat surface that's large enough to accommodate this. So I'm doing just like I did for the main frame, using a fireball tool square and squaring things up and getting it all tacked together. We got our base all tacked together here. What I've done is taken a piece of wood. First off, I measured from outside edge to outside edge. I got about 63 and 3/32. I was shooting for 63 inches overall, but within 3/32, that's good enough for me. It'll be just a hair wider. So what I did is then subtract that by 4, considering we have 2-inch bar and bar, and then made this piece here 59 and 3/32. And I did that because it's keeping this perfectly square and straight. If I were to just go ahead and weld that without these ends being secured in the proper place, it would probably just warp and just end up completely out of square, and that's not what we want. So temporarily having this piece of wood here to keep it in square is very important. I did use a 74-inch bar clamp, which I got off Amazon, which I will have linked. Just for simplicity, so I can flip it over, I decided to make this little bit out of wood. All I did was take a 2x4 and then another little piece of wood and created a block here, and then my clamp just slipped in and clamped it. So if you guys don't have a big bar clamp like that, you can just fashion something just like this to hold it nice and square while you do the finish welds. Here we're doing our finish welds and then stepping down through the different grits of flap disc to smooth out our corners and finishing it off with the mouse. At each of our 4 corners, we're going to have some 1x3 on the inset side, and then we're going to have some 1x2 on the outside. So those are going to sandwich together, as you can see here in our diagram. And I did that because first off, these two together is going to have some great strength at all 4 corners. And then also I did the 1x3 because now when we do our doors that flip up on the side, it's going to have a sealing surface to land on. So it just kind of integrates the sealing surface right into the structural design of the camper itself. This is just some 1/8 bar that we'll use for our bottom sealing surfaces. So right now I'm still undecided if I want to do a support in the middle with 2 separate doors or if I want to do one long door. I'm going to kind of get this all laid out, and actually I think get all 4 of my corners up, and then I can kind of get a real feel about how big a single door would be and how useful it would be to have 2 instead. When I was deciding on what angle I wanted to make this, because as you guys know, the base of our camper is 63 inches wide, and then the top part of our camper is 60 inches wide. So we're gonna have to have these on an angle to have them line up nicely. With the software, I decided to go ahead and do about 4 degrees, clamped in place, and it's mostly sitting perfectly. But you can see it'll have a slight tilt inward. It'll avoid making the camper just look like a box on the back of the truck, give it a little bit of streamline, and make it look good. The overall length on these 2 test pieces I did ended up being 23 inches. You'll notice this leg has a star on it, and that's because that is going to be my stencil to cut the whole rest of these legs. So for example, I hold this up to the piece of material that I'm going to be cutting next and scribe it so I know that my masterpiece here is going to make all the rest of my pieces the same exact length. If you were to just cut this piece and then use it to measure for this one, and then use this one to measure for the next one, and the next one to measure for that one, even though you're being as precise as you can be, you're going to end up getting it slightly longer and longer and longer, or slightly shorter and shorter and shorter as you go. So to avoid those variances, just go ahead and use the same piece to mark your material every single time, and it's going to be as accurate as possible. Making sure this part of the camper is all even and square is probably one of the most important steps throughout the whole build. This is laying the foundation for how the rest of your build is going to go. Like when it comes time to build our doors on the side, if our opening isn't completely square, then we're going to have uneven gaps all the way around. When we're going to lay our sheet metal on the roof or on the underside or that back wall, having things not square is just going to make it even more difficult to cut those to the right size. With all of our pieces cut and sanded, now we're forming our stacks, which are going to be our 4 corners. Here on the bench, I got an example of what we're doing here. We're stacking the 1x2 on top of the 1x3, and then here I got it mocked up on the frame itself. It's just clamped in place right now, just prepping to be tacked. This jig I built, I left a little bit of overhang here, and that was actually to keep the camper from being able to slide off of this while moving it around, and it actually worked out really good for this, especially for this mock-up. You can see there's a little bit of gap, but that's because this clamp is pulling it. It sits nice and flush whenever I pull it down there. So when I go to tack it, I won't have that clamp on there. I'll just be holding it with my hands. I think it was really beneficial to go ahead and have these clamped together and tack them there. They're not welded together. And my measurement from this outside edge to this outside edge is about 59 3/4. So when I put our 60-inch wide top on here, it should overhang each side about 1/8 of an inch, which will be nice because when I get that weld right here on this joint, it'll be a nice corner to weld in and should be nice and strong and also look a lot better than a butt joint. It can be a little tricky to hold the legs and get your tack weld started all at the same time. Luckily with a tack weld, even if you get one that's a little messed up, it's easy to break it off, grind it down, and start all over again. All 4 of our legs in place. All I did was tack them on the inside and outside, and I did just kind of tack them in the middle, and I'll probably end up grinding that down when I do my full weld, so that way it still looks pretty decent. It was rather easy to do. I just kind of held it in place. My rear of the camper is actually narrower from edge to edge than the front, but that was to be expected. Maybe these 4-degree cuts aren't perfect, or maybe this part of the aluminum is a little warped this way or this way. It doesn't take much to affect that measurement, so what I'm going to do now is actually remove this part of the camper. I'll set it off to the side, and then I'm going to get our main frame on here. Once our main frame is sitting on our wood frame here, I'll be able to lay this upside down on top of that, and it'll allow me to line up and use some of the bar clamps and jig and get this thing sitting exactly how I want it to on our part of our main frame. Neither of these frames weigh very much. It's just helpful to have a hand, especially when things are just tacked together, to make sure you're not too rough on it and get something skewed or bent or out of square while you're moving it around. So now we got our frame sitting upside down on our top. What I've done is I've flushed it up with this edge here, and then just to get even space on each side, actually this is part of the jig tool that came with my welding table, run it flush up against the side, and then I can see my screw is nice and flush with my post here. So now I can use this as a reference to make sure all 4 corners have the exact same spacing. Obviously I could take a ruler and try to measure. It's just easier when you have a reference like this that you can just quickly put up and be like, oh, yep, same spot. So first I will get our backside tacked here. And then when we're going to do our front side, it'll be a little trickier because of the way aluminum is and it bends and moves real easy. I'll have to pull some measurements from that edge to this back edge and make sure it's nice and even on both sides, just to make sure everything is nice and square. So we'll go ahead and get our back tacked up, and then we'll work on the front. Like I mentioned when we were making the cuts on these legs, this part of the frame, having it nice and square, is very important just to make sure the rest of our build goes nice and smooth. So take your time, make sure everything measures out to be exactly how you want it, and you'll thank yourself later. With our backside tacked, I'm just showing you guys how I'm setting this up to be able to tack our front. So what I did was take a measurement from this front edge all the way to that back edge, and I got just a hair under 63 inches, which is, we wanted this to be overall at least 63 inches, so that's, just fine. It's like less than 30 seconds under 63. We're gonna pull a measurement from that back side to this side. I had to do some adjustment here. Having the long bar clamp really comes in handy because I can put the bar clamp on there and turn this dial until I get exactly the same measurement from this edge to that edge as I had from up here. So that tells me that we're nice and straight up and down, front and back, and everything's looking symmetrical. As I mentioned before, I used this bit to do my spacing, used another clamp, put this here and clamp this on there. So now this thing is captured exactly where it needs to be, so I can lay down a tack or two, and then I know that it's not gonna move as I go to tack this in. With everything tacked in place and our wood stone position to hold the rear of our frame square, I feel confident enough to go ahead and do the finish welds on this part of the frame. We've pretty much got every contact point with our main frame finish welded. The only place we haven't welded yet is this seam, just because it'll be easier to work with when this thing is sitting upright. I've gone around and ground down all of my previous tacks that I did to hold this together. So what we'll do now, while it's upside down and this is easy to get to, finish all of these butt welds that are easily accessible, as well as get our cross member in right here where our verticals will mount to. Another little tip I want to show you guys, as you see, this is an open end and we're going to have to cap it. So what we're going to do is actually take a screw, and I drilled a hole in my piece. I made a piece that was exactly the right size. That way I can weld this in, and the screw allows me to hold this flush while I tack it in. As you know, with steel, you can just lay a magnet across that and it'll hold it nice and flush. With aluminum, it does present a little bit more of a challenge, not be able to use magnets to hold things where you need. So something simple like this little hole with a screw in it, and then of course once I get the edges welded, I'll pull our screw out, fill our little hole, and then grind it all flush. Honestly, one of the best things that I've done for this build is this little wood dolly. It is so nice having it at a workable level where I can either sit on it to access welds or line things up. It truly has made it so much easier than trying to work on the ground. Not to mention, I'm sure it's saving the surface of my camper quite a bit. As you know, aluminum is pretty soft and can gouge and scratch easy, so sitting on a nice soft wood surface really helps avoid getting any imperfections during this process. So as you guys saw from the time lapses, we got some other cross members in. I went to review my footage and I had some talking segments before I got all this stuff in, and somehow the audio was gone from the footage completely. So it's pretty much useless. So sorry about that. I'll just kind of give you a rundown of what I did. I did 3 supports across the front here. I'd use the 1x3 mainly because I had an excess of it. 1x2 would have been perfectly fine. You could even probably use some 1x1, but I figured some extra strength wouldn't hurt. And also I do plan to possibly mount a water tank up against this wall, so having some nice big fat slats to mount that on definitely help with that process. This is for our bed platform. This is a 1x1 1/8 of an inch wall. I ended up doing, these are about 43 inches long, and then I left this overhang here. I'm gonna have a platform that actually slides out to complete the bed, because this is only 43 inches, and then we'll have an additional about 29 inches to make it about 6 foot, a little over 6 footer, I believe. And that'll be plenty for the mattress that I'm planning on using right here. These went in nice and simple. I just did some welds along the sides and top. I didn't weld the bottom because I'm gonna have to be putting a sheet underneath of there, and of course the aluminum sheet that you see here is what I will be using, and that will also reinforce this space. I think I might do some insulation here just because it's underneath of the bed. That being said, the rest of the camper is not going to have insulation. I mean, I don't really see the need to try to insulate it, especially with these side doors being openers and all that stuff, but we'll see when we get there. Another issue I ran into that I want to talk to you guys about is when I was designing this, I made it so the length of this was the max length it could be as far as from edge to edge, and then I knew I was going to have this inside wall inset because the back window of the Tacoma kind of protrudes out a little bit. Of course, when I was making the design, I was like, okay, I'll just offset these so the inside wall will be flush. And then for some reason in my head, I did not wrap around the fact that then the panel that would go in here would have to also be inset. So that kind of brought up a few concerns, because as you know, even if I did cut out a panel that was perfectly this size and inset it in here, then I would run into issues with sealing, which means I'd have to run bars here and there and all along the top, and just make it a lot more cutting and welding and material than I ever planned to be. So what I ended up doing to solve this is I'm actually going to mount this panel on the inside, and it's not what I originally intended, and I wanted to have these slats exposed so it'd be easier to mount stuff, but I think it'll be just fine. So I had to add some 1x1 here. I added 1 on each side, and then now that gives me a nice continuous surface all the way around here that I'll be able to cut out a panel, mount it up against this wall, and then rivet it all in. And of course, once that's all in, I will be doing Sikaflex and all the joints and all that stuff. We'll get into that a little bit later, but it'll be nice and easy to make waterproof. And then I guess on the inside, it'll actually make it look nice because it'll be a nice blank wall. Then of course, this front section will be up against the cab, so you won't really be able to see it. You'll be able to see our supports here when you're looking between the cab and the truck, but I'm really not too worried about that, as I was more worried about getting a nice, good surface for me to mount this panel to and rivet it to. So that about wraps it up for this part of the build series. In the next video, I'm going to be finishing the bed platform. I'll be going ahead and putting the skin on this front wall, as well as the skin on the underside of the roof here. We'll be working on ideas for our side hatches here. Still am undecided if I want to do 2 doors or 1 door. I actually do have to order some more material, as I did come up just slightly short. So tonight I'm going to get some measurements, order some of this material, and then also depending on how lengthy it gets, I believe I will start working on the pop-up roof, as well as the hinge mechanisms on each end. So in the next video, this thing should really start to come together and start to look more like a camper. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you have any ideas on this camper build, please leave them in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Also, if you have any suggestions on more details you'd like to see or anything like that you feel like I'm leaving out, please leave that in the comments as well. I'd love your feedback, and I'd love to cater the rest of these videos to you guys the best that I can. Really excited to get more progress on this thing, and hopefully we'll see you guys on the next one.